So for this one, you got to find two numbers that added together equal negative 15. So that would be cosine of 30 minus 45 is one way to go. And when you're doing cosine, it's cosine of the first guy, cosine of the second guy, plus, remember with cosine the signs change, just use your formula sheets, sine of the first guy, sine of the second guy. So the cosine of 30 is root 3 over 2. The cosine of 45 is root 2 over 2, plus the sine of 30 is 1/2, and the sine of 45 is root 2 over 2. And then you just combine both of them on the left, and you would get root 6 over 4 plus root 2 over 4, which you can write as root 6 plus root 2 over 4. And remember, you can always check your answers. If you type in cosine of negative 15, it's going to give you an ugly decimal, and it should be the same ugly decimal when you key that in. So sine of 15, in order to get 15, you would do sine of 45 minus 30, and that is sine of the first guy, cosine of the second guy, minus sine of the second guy, cosine of the first guy. So the sine of 45 is root 2 over 2. The cosine of 30 is root 3 over 2, minus sine of 30 is 1/2 times root 2 over 2. And you'll get root 6 minus root 2 over 4. So way to get 105 would be the same as cosine of 45 plus 60. Remember, your answers don't have to be the same as mine, but they need to add up to 105. And that would be cosine of 45, cosine of 60. And since there's a plus here, it would be minus sine of 45, sine of 60. And the cosine of 45 is root 2 over 2. Cosine of 60 is 1/2 minus root 2 over 2 and root 3 over 2. And that's going to be root 2 minus root 6 over 4. Let me circle all these answers. Oh, there's that one up there. Okay. So the next one, you just have to figure out what formula to use. And it's cosine, cosine minus sine, sine. And if you look at the cosine of alpha plus beta and alpha minus beta, the one with the minus in the middle is the cosine of 116 plus 154, which is the cosine of 270, which is 0. That's on your unit circle. So this is also cosine, cosine, sine, sine. So you're looking at the law, the sum and difference with cosine. And since there's a minus in the middle, it's also cosine of 8 plus 82, which is cosine of 90, which is 0. The next one is sine cosine plus cosine sine, and since it has a plus in the middle, it's the sine of 217 plus 83, which is the sine of 300, which is negative root 3 over 2. On this other one, you've got cosine, cosine, sine, sine. So it's the cosine of the two subtracted from each other. Negative 2 theta is the first guy. Minus 2 theta is the second guy, because it would be a minus because there's a plus here in the middle. And that is cosine of negative 4 theta. Don't mess up on the signs. Those are pretty easy. Sine, cosine minus cosine sine would be the sine of the first guy minus the second guy, and that second guy has a negative on it, so it'd be the sine of 4x. And cosine, cosine, sine, sine with a plus in the middle would be the cosine of the first guy minus the second guy. And 3 minus 5 is negative 2 theta. So that is your final answer. If they want to use the half angle, then the sine of 105 is the same as the sine of 210 over 2, because 210 divided by 2 is 105. So now alpha becomes the 210, which is on your unit circle. And to find the sine, it's going to be 1 minus the cosine of alpha, which is 210, over 2, and it's all under the radical. So the cosine of 210 is negative root 3 over 2, and all that is under 2. So now we have, and all that is under the radical, so that we have 2 plus root 3 over 2, when you give it a common denominator, all over 2. And that becomes 2 plus root 3 under the radical. And downstairs becomes a 4, and the square root of 4 is 2. So that is your final answer. Now this one's a little squirrely, because when you double 247.5, you get 495. But then I'm going to go ahead and take 360 off of that so you can use your unit circle. So this is the same as the cosine. 495 minus 360 is 135, and that's what your alpha is going to be. And they want the cosine, so that's 1 plus cosine of 135 divided by 2, all under the hood. So we've got 1 plus cosine of 135 is negative root 2 over 2 over 2. And remember, 247.5 is in the third quadrant, so we know the answer is going to be negative. So we're going to go ahead and put that negative there because it's negative in that one. So now we have 2 minus root 2 over 4, because this turns into 2 over 2. And then we get the 2 down here that turns into the 4. So the final answer should be, with a negative in the front, negative 2 minus root 2 under the radical over 2. So when we double 285, we get 570. And when we subtract 360 from that, we get 210. So here alpha is going to be 210, and that's on your unit circle. So it's the cosine. So it's 1 plus cosine of 210 over 2, all under the radical. And 285 is in the fourth quadrant, because 270 is straight down. So 285 is in the fourth quadrant. And your cosine here is going to be positive, so you don't have to worry about the sign on this one. And what is the cosine of 210? It is root 3 over 2, negative root 3 over 2, so it's 1 minus root 3 over 2 over 2, all under the radical. This turns here into 2 over 2. So now we have 2 minus root 3 over 2, because that turns into a 4, and then the square root of 4 is 2. This next one's in the first quadrant. So for this next one, we know that it's in the first, theta is in the first quadrant. They want to know theta over 2, which is also going to be in the first quadrant, but we'll talk about that later. So this is, cosine is 5 over 13. That's adjacent over hypotenuse. We know that that's there, the 12. If we do a squared plus b squared equals c squared, we really don't need to do that. Well, to find the cosine of theta over 2 is 1 plus the cosine of theta, which they already gave us, is 5 over 13 over 2, all under the radical. Since it's in the first quadrant, half of it's also going to be in the first quadrant. And this is going to be equal to, so it's all going to be positive. It's going to be 18 over 26. And we're going to reduce that to 9 over 13, and we're going to give each one its own radical. Well, radical 9 is 3. Radical 13 stays radical 13. We can't have a radical in the basement. So we multiply by root 13 over root 13, and we get 3 root 13 over 13, and that is your final answer. Okay, so this one is still in the first quadrant, so we're still pretty easy. And tangent is opposite over adjacent, and we all know that that's there is a 5. It's a famous triangle, 3, 4, 5. And so the sine of theta over 2 is 1 minus cosine. So we know the cosine of theta is 3 over 5, still in the first quadrant. So it's 1 minus 3/5 over 2. Well, 1 is 5/5, so that is going to be 2/5 over 2, which is 2/10, which is 1 over 5. And the square root of 1 is 1. Square root of 5 is in the basement. You've got to multiply by root 5 over 5, and you get root 5 over 5. We know it's in the first quadrant because the half of an angle that's in the first quadrant is in the first quadrant. So if we do second tangent of 4/3, we get 53.13 degrees. But this angle is in the first quadrant, but after you went a full circle around. So you've got to add 360 to it. When you add 360, you get 413.13 degrees. And when you double that, you get 826.26 degrees. Well, now we can subtract 360 a couple times, and we end up with 106 degrees. That's so that you know the sign. The worst part of this is knowing what sign to put on it, so you can backtrack and know your sign. So 106 is going to be here. I'm going to put it in red. So we know that the cosine of that is going to be negative. So we know the answer is going to be negative. Now let's just let the math take us there. So here's our 4/3. It's going to be tangent, so 4/3. We know this is a 5. So the cosine of theta, cosine of 2 theta, is going to be cosine squared of theta minus sine squared of theta. So the cosine of theta is 3/5 squared minus 4/5 squared, and we get 9/25 minus 16/25, which is negative 7/25, which we know is accurate because it's supposed to be in the second quadrant. This next one is in the fourth quadrant, and the sine is negative 4/5, and we know this is a negative 3. So your cosine of 2 theta is cosine squared of theta minus sine squared of theta. And remember, there's 3 different choices. I'm just picking that one. The cosine is negative 3/5 minus negative 4/5 squared, which is 9/25 minus 16/25, which is also negative 7/25. Okay, so this one is in the second quadrant, and the cosine is negative 3/5, so we know this is a positive 4. So cosine of 2 theta is cosine squared of theta minus sine squared of theta. Well, the cosine of theta is negative 3/5 squared minus 4/5 squared. And it's the same numbers over and over again. So we have 9/25 minus 16/25, which is negative 7/25. This is the other difficult one because it's from 540 to 630. If you take 360 away from those, you end up in the third quadrant, but after taking a full turn. So we have here 4/5, and this is a negative 3. So if you do second sine of -4/5, it ends up being minus 53 degrees. But you need to move it over to the 180 side, to the third quadrant side, because that's where theta is. So you're going to take 180 plus 53.13 degrees. Then when you double that, you get your number, and then subtract 360 until you get out of the woods, and it ends up being in the second quadrant. And sine in the second quadrant is positive. If you need help, get somebody in class to explain that to you. And so we have sine of 2 theta, which is 2 sine of theta cosine of theta. And that's 2 times -4/5 times -3/5, which is 2 times 12, which is 24/25. And that is the correct answer.